I think that just as we're living in a nuclear age, we have grown so tremendously in scientific knowledge. It doesn't seem too much to say that men can begin to awaken to the fact that they haven't grown enough spiritually and haven't recognized their spiritual capacities.
Once something like eating is death, then you've struck at the very heart of life. The enemy of the older radical theories may have been the ruling class, but today the stakes of whether we will reform ourselves into a new kind of human being, a new kind of society, whether we will find selves worth being, the stakes of it are simply life itself.
This is a segment of a full session on Wendell Berry's The Art of the Commonplace, taught by Dr. Jeremy Cowan for the Morin Academy. If you want to get in on this class and a lot more of our offerings, head over to Patreon, and I will put our link in the show notes below. And you can also check out everything we offer on our website, pmorin.org.
So where this last week was about belonging or becoming a member of the place, this week we're going to move on to maybe more small daily type acts, or at least how to look at the problems that we're facing and take action on a more appropriate scale. I think that's probably a fairly clean way of saying that. So his logic is pretty simple. If you are looking at the world with a correct perception, that should lead to correct practice. And once we see our place, our work, our communities clearly, we can only treat them carelessly at our peril at that point. So we're going to turn that vision, that seeing, that becoming into doing. And we're going to do that through the essays Think Little and The Pleasures of Eating. I'm going to go through Think Little kind of a little bit like we did last week, and then The Pleasures of Eating. I think maybe we're going to do a little more participatory reading on it, simply because, I don't know, I guess it's got some really good excerpts that I'd much rather just get into and read whole rather than trying to summarize, simply because they're better from the horse's mouth, as one might say. So let's move on. So Wendell Berry wrote Think Little before 1970. It was reprinted, so I don't know the original printing date, but again, I think I mentioned this last time with A Native Hill, that it had been reprinted in the Good Earth catalog in 1969. This one had as well. But it was written in an age of urgency. There was war abroad. We had civil rights struggles here at home. Pollution was becoming stifling, and there was corruption and rapid change. I don't know that much has changed today, but this was a time of, I don't know if this was the awakening, if it wasn't the midway through that awakening and people taking action against those things, but we saw good people pouring lots of energy into these vast causes. There was a lot of calls demanding for new laws, new programs, new movements. But Berry in this essay recognizes a deeper pattern. We prefer, as a species, I think we prefer to have large problems because they allow us to ignore our small bit of responsibility. So he basically makes the argument that the activist often wants, sorry, I need to make an adjustment here. The activist often wants the appearance of moral involvement, but without the discipline of living the moral life. And that's not to paint with a broad brush so much as to provide a more general abstraction of what he saw as the activist mindset. So it's easier to shout for justice than to just practice it in your neighborhood, in your marriage, in your meals, in your work. He's not, like I said, attacking the reformers. He's asking what good is changing a law if we're all still going to individually live wastefully, destructively, dishonestly, because the world that we build is only a mirror of our own character. And politics, he says, is pretty much devoid of affection because it's reflecting lives that are increasingly devoid of affection. And I'm not saying devoid of emotion, and we definitely see a lot of emotion, especially in protests and things like that. Um, and some, maybe all protesters, activists believe that their motives turn on affection. But when this is probably not fair because I've probably seen it. And those who lived through that era probably saw it even more. But where is real love in a protest? Now, there's lots of stories. I'm a little younger than this, but lots of stories about um, the late 60s, early 70s, and all of the love that was going on. I'm just thinking about the protests that we've seen recently. I mean, we have January 6th, Minneapolis. Those are protests where love really appears to be absent, despite whatever the protesters' motives are, at least on the surface. Um, I think we forget that love is an active verb. Love is not something that you receive. Love is not something that you feel. Love is something that we give. And while it's entirely possible, I think, to have protests where you are giving love, um, they don't look like this image here on the left. Nobody in that image looks like a very loving, uh, that they're in a very loving posture. Contrast that to the image on the right, and or at least the portion of the image on the right, and perhaps now you see an act of protest that is more reflective of love. So he says specifically, we don't, but even the most articulate public protest is not enough. We don't live in the government or in institutions or in public utterances and acts, and the environmental crisis has its roots in our lives. By the same token, environmental health will also be rooted in our lives. That is, I take it, simply a fact. And in the light of it, we can see how superficial and foolish we would be to think that we could correct what is wrong merely by tinkering with the institutional machinery. The changes that are required are fundamental changes in the way we are living. Um, there's another great quote that he has here. But the environmental, this is page 83 if you've got that and want to follow along. But the environmental crisis rises closer to home. Every time we draw a breath, every time we drink a glass of water, every time we eat a bite of food, we are suffering from it. And more important, every time we indulge in or depend on the wastefulness of our economy, and our economy's first principle is waste, we are causing the crisis. Nearly every one of us, nearly every day of his life, is contributing directly to the ruin of this planet. A protest meeting on the issue of environmental abuse is not a convocation of accusers, it is a convocation of the guilty. And I when I read something like this from Barry, I immediately go to thinking about myself and my own impacts because, like I said, I just had a job interview. That job interview was in California, and that meant a couple of hops on a plane, about 3.5, 4 hours of driving, and a fair amount of carbon being emitted through those actions. On top of that, when you're traveling like that, I had at least one I had one fast food meal two sit downs, and several snacks along the way. Each one of those felt out of necessity at the time, but in reflection, some of that could have been mitigated, right? You can't really bring a lot onto an airplane anymore, but I could have gone to a grocery store and prepared something in my hotel room, that kind of a thing. That's not to say that we can't have conveniences, but it's really hard to scream and yell about um, issues with the economy when we're participating in it relatively fully. So, in this idea, or at least in changing our focus or distracting our focus from our own individual contributions and instead looking at things as societal or global problems, we're effectively destroying our individuality and or our um, not capacity, but the moral authority of the individual on which I guess the American experiment could be said to be built on. So in this portion, he's really sharpening his critique, and this is where he starts to encourage us to think little. Um, and he's naming the obstacle. We've almost destroyed the conditions for thinking little at all by not offshoring, but outsourcing everything in this life. So there's a quote here that I'm going to read. What we are up against in this country in any attempt to invoke private responsibility is that we have nearly destroyed private life. Our people have given up their independence in return for the cheap seductions and the shoddy merchandise of so-called affluence. We have delegated all our vital functions and responsibilities to salesmen and agents and bureaus and experts of all sorts. We cannot feed or clothe ourselves or entertain ourselves or communicate with each other or be charitable or neighborly or loving or even respect ourselves without recourse to a merchant or a corporation or a public service organization or any agency of the government or a style setter or an expert. Most of us cannot think of dissenting from the opinions or the actions of one organization without first forming a new organization. Individualism is going around these days in uniform, handing out the party line on individualism. Dissenters want to publish their personal opinions over 1,000 signatures. And it's really interesting because he wrote this pre-1970. And we go back and look at this. I think feeding and clothing ourselves is one thing, but entertaining ourselves. I mean, we've turned to screens to entertain us constantly. Not that that wasn't possible in 1970, but it's ubiquitous now. Um, we can't be charitable or neighborly or loving without an app, a GoFundMe, or, you know, those kinds of things. And then the forming a new organization, I actually kind of chuckle at simply because I've started a new organization in the past to address the exact kind of problems that I saw through the lens of Wendell Berry. Um, it's interesting just how prescient these words were then, and in all likelihood continue to be, especially as we're in the dawning of the age of AI. Um, it's it's interesting. So his point isn't really anti-organization. It's more of a moral philosophy. It's or moral psychology. When every basic act requires some intermediary, then we really lose the habits of responsibility. Um, yeah, we begin to think that even goodness, even like the charity, the being neighborly, is all outsourceable and ought to be outsourced. Just like entertainment even laundry. I mean, down to the very simplest of tasks, we've found ways to monetize and or outsource it, depending on which end of the transaction you end up on. And that's the space where virtue is now practiced. We see it socially as virtuous to to hire out every single act. I mean, even disposing of dirty diapers is now outsourced. And the virtue in it is that, well, we're making sure that our diapers are properly disposed of, hopefully, but also we're building an economy. We're providing work for other people. And these are virtues in our minds, while at the same time we're losing touch with our own capacity for taking responsibility for those things, because once it's left, it's out of sight, out of mind, and we're really only comforted by whoever that company is and their marketing prowess, right? I mean, if they tell you that they're going to be um, responsibly disposing of those dirty diapers, I mean, you take them at their word, right? And assume that that's what they're actually doing. Whether or not they are, once it's gone, we have no way of knowing, and how many people actually follow up on it until someone does. And then there's all the outrage because, look, they tricked us, they lied to us. It's always their fault, but never ours um, for handing off our own responsibility to somebody else whose real interest is in themselves, as most of our interests are. So then he shifts from the household, and this was more just as like a bellwether. Um, so he's shifting from the household to the nation's soil. And if you want to look at how far our culture has drifted from the earth and taking responsibility for our place here on the earth, he says you just have to look at the farmer, and the farmer effectively becomes our moral thermometer of sorts. So he says, for an index of our loss for an index of our loss of contact with the earth, we need only look at the condition of the American farmer, who must, in our society, as in every society, enact man's dependence on the land and his responsibility to it. In an age of unparalleled affluence and leisure, the American farmer is harder pressed and harder worked than ever before. His margin of profit is small, his hours are long, his outlays for land and equipment and the expenses of maintenance and operation are growing rapidly greater. He cannot compete with industry for labor. He is being forced more and more to depend on the use of destructive chemicals and on the wasteful methods of haste and anxiety. As a class, farmers are one of the most despised minorities. So far as I can see, farming is considered marginal or incidental to the economy of the country, and farmers, when they are thought of at all, are thought of as hicks and yokels whose lives do not fit into the modern scene. The average American farmer is now an old man whose sons have moved away to the cities. His knowledge and his intimate connection with the land are about to be lost. The small independent farmer is going the way of the small independent craftsmen and storekeepers. He is being forced off the land into the cities, his place taken by absentee owners, corporations, and machines. Some would justify all this in the name of efficiency. As I see it, it is an enormous social and economic and cultural blunder. For the small farmers who lived on the farms, cared about their land, and given their established connection to the land, which was often hereditary and traditional as well as economic, they could have been encouraged to care for it more competently than they have so far. The corporations and machines that replace them will never be bound to the land by the sense of birthright and continuity or by the love that enforces care. They will be bound by the rule of efficiency, which takes thought only of the volume of this year's produce and takes no thought of the slow increment of the life of the land, not measurable in pounds or dollars, which will assure the livelihood and health of the coming generations. So he's diagnosing more than just rural decline here, right? He's exposing this moral inversion where we've taken the yeoman farmer that Thomas Jefferson said that was essential to a thriving republic. And now we've made that person or that class of people into be uh, environmental villains and um, poor backwards people that just whose opinions we should not in any way hold dear only because there are so few of them and they have no real recourse at the ballot box.